Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really honored to be here. I'm also a little uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable for three reasons being asked to speak to you in this panel. The first one is, this is a subject of serious conversation that I think we need to have. I'm uncomfortable with the title Man Up. I wonder, this is a conversation I think we need to have. To what extent do we want to use traditional notions of masculinity to engage men around gender equality? Do we want to say real men don't hit women? Real men don't discriminate? You know, come on guys, man up. I'm agnostic on the question, but I want to raise it as an issue that I think we should discuss. The second reason I'm a little uncomfortable is because I am not going to say anything to you that women haven't been saying for 40 years. So it does seem a little bit odd. It does seem a little bit odd, makes me a little uncomfortable that suddenly when men are talking about this, it's like, okay, where are the TV cameras? So I want to acknowledge that the work that I do is based on and inspired by the work that feminist women have been doing for all of these years. And you'll hear in my remarks something that will sort of address that issue. And the third reason I'm uncomfortable is because it's a little ironic, don't you think, to have an American come to talk to you about gender equality? I mean, we can only sit and wish that we had a state sector at all, but that we were able to accomplish in the US what you have already accomplished here. Now, that's not to say we're there yet, or that you're there yet, but just that it's a bit ironic to be an American. And I want to illustrate that there's something that Americans would know. There's a very typical kind of cartoon or trope in which you have a street scene with a very, very rich man in a nice suit walking by a homeless beggar. And the traditional way this would be framed would be that the rich guy would say to the homeless guy, "Get a job." This is very familiar to us. We don't much like welfare states. So this idea would be familiar to Americans. And the reason I'm telling you this story is because just recently in the magazine, The New Yorker, they had an updated version of it. The rich man is walking past the beggar and says to him, "Move to Sweden." So that's why I think it's a little ironic for me to be here. Okay, what I want to do is I want to take as a framework the question about how to engage men in gender equality. How do we engage men in gender equality? And that has three parts, and I'll address each of them. The first part is the men's relationship, not to gender equality, but just to gender. The second question is men's relationship to gender equality. And the third is how to engage men. This is a question that, as an American, really concerns me. Because as an American, I am very concerned with how we sell it. This is a marketing strategy. How do we engage men in gender equality? Now, we shouldn't have to. The ethical imperative should be enough. It's right, it's fair, it's just, we should support it. That doesn't get very far with men. So as I've worked with men over the past 30 years, I have tried to figure out ways to engage them, and that's what I'll talk with you about. So the first question is men's relationship to gender. I think you will agree with me that one of the signal contributions, one of the most dramatic changes in our world today is that women made gender visible. We now know that gender is one of the organizing principles of social life. We now know that gender is one of the foundations of your identity. Let me say, 40 years ago, we didn't know this. 40 years ago, if you went to graduate school and said you wanted to study gender, you would not find one course. In fact, in my field, I'm a sociologist, if you'd said you wanted to study women, you would have found one course, 40 years ago, and that was marriage and the family. For years, that was like the ladies' auxiliary of the social sciences. Today, as you know, there's women's studies courses, gender studies courses everywhere. Women made gender visible. The problem, that is worth applauding. But here's the problem with that. Women made gender visible, but it remains visible mostly to women. When you hear the word gender, we think women. Most men don't know that gender is as important to us as women understand it is to them. Gender remains largely invisible to men, and that invisibility is political. So, following some of the other speakers, let me tell you my own story about this. This is a story that takes place when I was in graduate school 30 years ago. A bunch of us were sitting around one day, and somebody said, and remember this is 30 years ago, and it's going to sound anachronistic for a reason. 30 years ago, we were sitting around and somebody said, you know, there's an explosion of writing and thinking in feminist theory, but there's no courses yet. So we did what graduate students typically do. We said, let's have a study group. So we got together each week, 11 women and me, and we decided we would read a text in theory and talk about it. And during one of our meetings, I witnessed a conversation between two women that changed everything for me. One was white and one was black. The white woman said, this is the part that's going to sound anachronistic, the white woman said, all women face the same oppression as women, and therefore all women have an intuitive solidarity or sisterhood. And the black woman said, I'm not so sure. Let me ask you a question. So the black woman says to the white woman, when you wake up in the morning and you look in the mirror, what do you see? And the white woman said, I see a woman. And the black woman said, you see, that's the problem. Because when I wake up in the morning and I look in the mirror, she said, I see a black woman. To me, race is visible. But to you, race is invisible. You don't see it. And then she said something really startling. She said, that's how privilege works. Privilege is invisible to those who have it. It is a luxury. It is a luxury I'm saying this to the white people in the room, not to have to think about race every split second of our lives. Privilege is invisible to those who have it. So you'll remember, of course, I was the only man in this group. So I witnessed this and I went, oh, somebody said, what was that reaction? And I said, well, when I wake up in the morning and I look in the mirror, I see a human being. I'm kind of the generic person. You know, I'm a middle-class white man. I have no race, no class, no gender. I'm universally generalizable. So I like to think that was the moment I became a middle-class white man. That class and race and gender were not about other people. They were about me. I had to start thinking about them, and I had to take on the question of the privilege that had kept it invisible to me for so long. So that's the first thing. Why do not men engage with gender is because it's invisible to us. And that invisibility is political. Second point I want to make is why don't men engage in gender equality? And here, I want to tell you one more story. It's the basis for, it was the beginning point of my new book, Angry White Men. I was on a TV talk show. You're all familiar with it. You know, black female host, came from Chicago. And I was on the show opposite four angry white men. Four white men who believed that they were the victims of reverse discrimination in the workplace. That affirmative action is reverse discrimination against white men. And these guys all said they were qualified for jobs, qualified for promotions. They didn't get them, and they were really angry about it. So I was there to oppose them. So they all tell their story, and then it's my turn to speak. Now, the reason I'm telling you this story is I want you to hear the title of this particular show. The title was a quote from one of these men. And the line was, "A black woman stole my job." So I said, after they had all told how they were qualified for the job, qualified for the promotion, I said, I have one question for you about this show, about the title of the show, a black woman stole my job. And I have it's only about one word in the title. I want to know about the word my. Where did you get the idea it was your job? Why isn't the title of the show, A Black Woman Got the Job, or A Black Woman Got a Job? Because without confronting men's sense of entitlement, we will never understand why so many men resist gender equality. Because we think this is a level playing field. We think this is a level playing field, so we think any policy that tilts it even a little bit, we think, oh my God, water's rushing uphill. It's reverse discrimination against us. So let us be very clear. White men in Europe and the United States are the beneficiaries of the single greatest affirmative action program in the history of the world. It's called the history of the world. So now I've pointed out two arguments. Now I made two claims. One claim is men need to see gender. Second, that men's resistance to gender equality comes from that sense of entitlement. Now my third point is how then do we engage men in gender equality? How then do we engage them? How do we bring them into this conversation? Here, the data are actually quite persuasive. Here, as a social scientist, I feel well grounded in making the case not that gender equality is right and fair and just, which it is, but rather that it is in men's interest to support it. That gender equality is actually a good thing for men. And here's what the data show. There's some psychological studies that have looked at what makes for a successful relationship, what makes for a successful marriage. And it turns out that the thing that is the best variable for what makes for a successful marriage turns out to be equity. That's not necessarily exact equality. It's equity. It's the perception of fairness. The perception of fairness is what enables a marriage or a relationship to succeed. Now, how, as a social scientist, how do you measure that? Sociologists have found ways to measure this that basically comes down to two variables. One, does the woman, now this is across all kinds of cultures, advanced industrial cultures, pre-industrial cultures. One, can the woman own property in her own name after she's married? Basically a measure of women's autonomy. Does she lose herself in her husband's identity? And the second is how much housework and childcare does the man do? The more housework and childcare that men do, the more the perception of equity, the more equal the relationship, the more likely it is to thrive. Here's what the data show. Now I'm going to say, here's how I think we motivate men. One, when men share housework and childcare, their children do better in school. When men share housework and childcare, their children have lower rates of depression, are less likely to see therapists, less likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, have higher grades. When men share housework and childcare, their children are happier, healthier, do better in school. Okay, maybe that's not enough of a motivation for men. When men share housework and childcare, their wives are happier. Duh. Not only that, their wives are healthier. Their wives are less likely to go to therapists, less likely to be diagnosed with depression. Their wives are more likely to go to gyms. They are much more likely to report higher levels of marital satisfaction. Okay, maybe that's not enough of a motivation for men. When men share housework and childcare, the men are happier. The men are healthier. They smoke less, drink less, take recreational drugs less often, more likely to go to a doctor for screening, less likely to go to the emergency room. They are less likely to see therapists, be diagnosed with depression. When men share housework and childcare, the men are happier and healthier. Okay, maybe that's not enough of a motivation for men. When men share housework and childcare, they have more sex. Now, of these four interesting findings, which one do you think Men's Health magazine put on its cover? Housework makes her horny. Not when she does it. And let me just say that the men in the room, I want to be very clear about this to you. This data were collected over a really long time. So I don't want any of the men in the room to say, I'm doing the dishes tonight. Really long time. So my argument, to conclude, my argument is that making this case to men, that if we want to have the kind of relationships with our children, with our partners, with our wives, with our friends, that we say we want to have, the only way we will be able to do that is by supporting gender equality. Let me leave you with one quote. This is a quote from 1916. It is a quote from a man supporting the women's suffrage movement in 1916. And it's an article that he wrote entitled "Feminism for Men." And this is the first line of the article, and I'll leave it with you as a way to think about engaging men. This is the line. Feminism will make it possible for the first time for men to be free. Thank you very much.